Connor Hayes watched his 7-year-old son Mason methodically fold his 47th origami crane from discarded napkin scraps. The autumn breeze swept through Millbrook Park as Mason arranged each delicate paper bird in perfect spirals across the weathered picnic table. Suddenly, piercing screams shattered the tranquil afternoon. 2 blonde twin girls were being shoved violently to the ground by a hulking older boy, their small bodies crumpling against the concrete. "Nobody wants you, freaks!" the bully snarled, yanking their hair with vicious force. Connor's blood ignited. He bolted forward, his protective fury unleashing as the coward fled into the maze of playground equipment. As he knelt beside the trembling girls, brushing dirt from their torn clothes, rapid footsteps approached. A woman emerged from the shadows, designer clothes clashing with her wild desperation, manicured hands shaking as she reached for her daughters. Their eyes locked. Something flickered behind her polished facade, a recognition that made Connor's chest tighten with inexplicable dread. What Connor didn't know was that this woman held the power to change his entire future with a single decision. "Oh my God, thank you!" the woman gasped, dropping to her knees beside the twins. Her voice carried an educated refinement that seemed oddly out of place in this simple neighborhood park. The girls didn't cry. They simply stared at Connor with those piercing blue eyes, as if evaluating whether he was trustworthy. Mason approached cautiously, his routine disrupted, but his curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. He held out one of his carefully crafted origami cranes to the nearest twin, who accepted it with the faintest smile. "I'm Connor," he said, helping the woman to her feet. "This is my son, Mason." The woman hesitated for just a moment too long before responding. "Diana, these are my daughters." No last names offered, no further explanation. Connor noticed how she instinctively positioned herself between her children and any potential observers, as if she was accustomed to being watched. Her designer handbag bore no visible logos, but the quality of the leather spoke of serious money. Diana's phone buzzed urgently in her purse. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale, quickly declining the call. "I should get them home," she said, gathering the twins with practiced efficiency. But as she turned to leave, one of the girls tugged on Connor's sleeve and whispered, "Thank you for helping us." The genuine gratitude in her small voice made Connor's heart ache. It reminded him of how vulnerable Mason had been after his mother's death. What kind of life did these children live that made a stranger's kindness so remarkable? 3 years ago, Connor's world had collapsed when Rachel died in that senseless car accident. Mason was only 4 then, barely speaking even before the trauma sent him further into his shell. Connor had quit his lucrative corporate design job to become a full-time father, learning to navigate Mason's autism while grieving his own devastating loss. Now they lived in a modest apartment, surviving on sporadic freelance projects and the disability benefits that barely covered Mason's therapy. The origami had become Mason's coping mechanism, each fold a small victory over the chaos in his young mind. Mrs. Chen from next door often watched them from her kitchen window during their daily park visits. "That man understands patience," she would tell her husband in Mandarin. "His boy is lucky to have father who sees the beauty in differences." Connor had learned to read Mason's needs like a complex instruction manual when the world became too loud, too bright, too overwhelming for his sensitive son to process. The park had become their sanctuary, a place where Mason could arrange his paper creations without judgment from a world that often struggled to understand children like him. The next afternoon brought Diana and the twins back to Millbrook Park, almost as if she had been waiting for Connor and Mason to arrive. She carried an expensive art supply bag but dressed more casually than the day before, though her posture still suggested someone accustomed to command. The twins gravitated toward Mason's origami display, fascinated by the precise patterns he created with such methodical care. Diana watched this interaction with an intensity that made Connor curious. Most adults saw Mason's repetitive behaviors as concerning, but she observed them with something approaching professional interest. "Your son has remarkable focus," Diana commented, settling onto the bench beside Connor. Not everyone appreciates that kind of systematic thinking. The way she chose her words felt deliberate, as if she was accustomed to measuring each phrase for its potential impact. Mason was teaching the twins how to fold basic paper boats, his usual anxiety around strangers mysteriously absent in their presence. Diana unpacked watercolor supplies, revealing an artist's understanding of color theory and technique that went far beyond casual hobby. "You studied art?" Connor asked, noting how she instinctively guided the twins through proper brush handling and color mixing. "Once upon a time," Diana replied with a wistful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I used to think creativity was the most important thing in the world, before I learned that responsibility trumps passion every time." There was a bitterness in her voice that suggested hard-won experience, the kind that comes from sacrificing dreams for survival. Connor understood that particular pain intimately. A week later, Connor encountered Diana at Henderson's grocery, standing in the organic produce section with a cart full of expensive items while he clutched his carefully organized coupon collection. She seemed startled to see him, quickly positioning her body to block his view of her overflowing cart. "What a coincidence," she said with forced brightness, but Connor noticed how she discreetly folded her receipt before he could glimpse the total. Mason, oblivious to adult awkwardness, announced loudly, "Why does Miss Diana buy so much fancy food?" Diana's cheeks flushed crimson as she mumbled something about buying for a project. Their third encounter happened on a rainy Thursday at the Millbrook Public Library during children's story time. Diana and the twins were already seated in the back corner, maintaining their usual distance from other families. The librarian read a cheerful book about different types of families, but Connor noticed how the twins remained silent while other children participated enthusiastically. When Mason became overwhelmed by the crowd's noise and energy, Diana immediately moved to his aid, creating a small barrier with her body while speaking to him in low, calming tones that demonstrated surprising knowledge of autism management techniques. "You understand him?" Connor observed gratefully as Mason's breathing returned to normal. "I understand what it feels like to be different," Diana replied quietly. "To feel like you're constantly being watched and judged for not fitting into neat little boxes." There was something profound in her admission, a vulnerability that made Connor wonder what kind of scrutiny she faced in her own life. She handed Mason origami crane number 73, which he had crafted during the story, back to her as if it were a precious gift. For the first time since Rachel's death, Connor felt the stirrings of attraction toward another person. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had promised Rachel he would love her forever, whispered those words at her hospital bedside as machines failed to save her life. But watching Diana's gentle patience with Mason, seeing how she treated his son's differences as strengths rather than deficits, Connor wondered if maybe he was allowed to feel happiness again. Rachel would want Mason to have positive female influences, wouldn't she? "Mason's father died?" Diana asked carefully during one of their conversations, her voice soft with sympathy. "His mother," Connor corrected, surprised by how easily he could speak about it now. "Car accident 3 years ago. Single parenting is—" He paused, searching for words that could encompass the overwhelming responsibility, the constant worry, the fierce protective love that consumed his every waking moment. "The hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important." Diana's eyes filled with unshed tears, and Connor sensed that she understood something about impossible choices and overwhelming responsibility. But there were inconsistencies in Diana's story that nagged at Connor's consciousness. She spoke about business trends with the authority of someone who made strategic decisions rather than merely consulting on them. Her phone calls, always taken in private, involved phrases like merger timeline and board approval that suggested far more responsibility than a typical consultant would handle. The twins were remarkably well-behaved, almost trained to be invisible in public spaces, as if they had learned early that drawing attention brought unwelcome consequences. During their picnic lunch, Diana's phone rang with yet another urgent call. Connor heard her say, "Yes, I'll handle the merger personally when I return," before quickly ending the conversation and offering an embarrassed smile. "Work never stops," she said weakly, but Connor was beginning to wonder exactly what kind of work required such high-level decision-making authority. The pieces didn't fit together, and his designer's mind was trained to spot inconsistencies in patterns. Who was Diana really? And why did she seem so afraid of being discovered? 2 weeks into their strange friendship, Connor's phone rang with the call that would change everything. "Mr. Hayes, this is Jennifer Morrison from Blackwood Digital Agency. We received your portfolio submission and would like to schedule an interview for our senior designer position." Connor's heart leaped. Blackwood Digital was exactly the kind of stable, prestigious company that could provide the security Mason needed. The salary would mean real healthcare, consistent therapy coverage, maybe even a house with a yard where Mason could create his origami gardens in private. Connor arrived at the gleaming Blackwood Tower 40 minutes early, using the extra time to rehearse his talking points and calm his nerves. The lobby impressed him with its clean lines and expensive materials, suggesting a company that valued both aesthetics and success. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 30s, guided him through a maze of glass-walled offices toward the executive conference room. "Ms. Blackwood will see you now," she announced, opening the door to reveal a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hartford skyline. Connor stepped inside and felt his world tilt off its axis. Behind the polished conference table sat Diana, but not the casual park mother he had grown to care about. This Diana wore a sharp business suit that commanded respect, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized her natural authority. Her makeup was flawless, her posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions. This was Diana Blackwood, CEO of the company he desperately needed to join, the woman who had been studying him for weeks without revealing her true identity. "Mr. Hayes," Diana said in a professionally neutral tone that made Connor's skin crawl. "Thank you for coming in today." She gestured to the chair across from her, as if they were complete strangers, as if she hadn't watched him comfort his autistic son through a meltdown just 3 days earlier. Connor's mind raced through every conversation they had shared, every moment of vulnerability he had offered, wondering how much of it had been genuine connection versus corporate due diligence. Had she been evaluating him as a potential employee all along? Diana, Ms. Blackwood, outlined the position requirements with the same thorough professionalism she probably brought to every business decision. But Connor barely processed the job description because he was too busy analyzing every previous interaction through this new lens of betrayal. She knew about his financial struggles because she had researched his background. She understood Mason's needs because she had studied his application materials. Every coincidental meeting at the park suddenly felt calculated, manipulative, dishonest in ways that made his stomach turn. "Mr. Hayes, you seem distracted," Diana observed with the sharp attention to detail that probably made her an effective CEO. "Is something wrong?" The casual use of his first name confirmed what Connor already suspected. She had known exactly who he was from their very first meeting. "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Just surprised by the scope of the position." Diana's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a flicker of the vulnerable woman he thought he had been falling for. As Diana described the job responsibilities, Connor noticed how she carefully wove in details about the company's family-friendly policies and excellent healthcare benefits. She knew precisely which incentives would appeal to a single father with a special needs child, because she had been gathering intelligence about his situation for weeks. "This position requires someone trustworthy and discreet," she said meaningfully. "Someone who understands professional boundaries." The implication was clear. Their personal relationship had to remain separate from any professional arrangement. "I'll need time to consider the offer," Connor said, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't quite identify. Anger, certainly, but also disappointment and a profound sense of manipulation that made him question everything he thought he knew about human nature. "Of course," Diana replied, but her voice softened as she added, "Connor, I hope personal acquaintance won't affect your professional judgment. This position stands on its own merits." The admission that she had deliberately concealed her identity felt like salt in an open wound. Connor stood to leave, but paused at the door when Diana spoke again. "Mr. Hayes." Her voice held a vulnerability that reminded him of the woman who had comforted Mason during his library meltdown. Not everything was business. The statement hung in the air like a question, an apology, or maybe just a desperate attempt to salvage something real from the wreckage of their deception. But Connor was too hurt and confused to offer forgiveness in that moment. He needed time to process the revelation that the woman he was beginning to love had been lying to him from the very beginning. The next morning, Connor returned to Millbrook Park with Mason, unsure whether Diana would maintain their routine or disappear entirely now that her secret was exposed. She was there, waiting on their usual bench, but she had reverted to her simple park mother persona: jeans, minimal makeup, the careful vulnerability that had first attracted him. "I hoped you would come," she said quietly as Mason ran towards the twins with his latest origami creations. Connor remained standing, maintaining physical distance as a barrier against his own conflicted emotions. "We need to talk," Connor said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. Diana nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I know," she whispered. "About yesterday. About Blackwood Digital." The admission felt like pulling teeth, each word extracted with obvious difficulty. Connor studied her face, searching for signs of the calculated CEO who had interviewed him less than 24 hours earlier. "You're the CEO," he stated flatly. "You've been the CEO this entire time." Diana's composure crumbled like wet tissue paper. "I can explain," she began, but Connor cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Explain what?" His voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm, causing several other park visitors to glance in their direction. "That every conversation, every coincidental meeting was you studying me. Research for a potential hire." The twins looked up from their play with Mason, sensing the adult tension even if they couldn't understand its source. Diana's protective instincts kicked in, and she lowered her voice to avoid frightening the children. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complicated than Connor had expected. Diana revealed that she was recently divorced from Richard Sterling, her former business partner who had tried to destroy both her company and her relationship with their daughters during their bitter separation. She had won control of Blackwood Digital, but only after months of legal warfare that had left her emotionally exhausted and professionally paranoid. The park visits were her escape from the crushing pressure of running a major corporation while fighting for custody of her children. "Meeting you was genuinely accidental," Diana insisted, her eyes pleading for understanding. "But when I saw your portfolio cross my desk a week later, I should have told you immediately." She explained how she had discovered his job application after their second park encounter, creating an ethical dilemma that she had handled poorly. For the first time in years, someone saw me as just Diana. Not CEO Diana, not divorced Diana, not the woman who fought her ex-husband for control of a multi-million-dollar company. Just a mum who understood your son. Connor felt his anger wavering in the face of her obvious pain, but he couldn't shake the fundamental violation of trust that her deception represented. "So, the job offer?" he asked, needing to understand the full scope of her manipulation. "Is completely legitimate," Diana replied humbly. "Your portfolio impressed the hiring committee before I even knew you had applied. I should have recused myself from the interview process, but I was selfish. I wanted to see if business Connor matched Park Connor." The admission of selfishness felt more honest than any professional explanation she could have offered. The class divide between them suddenly felt insurmountable. Diana wasn't a trapped victim or a struggling single mother. She was a powerful CEO who had chosen to deceive him, even with good intentions. "You have a company to run," Connor said quietly. "Decisions to make that affect hundreds of people. I'm a freelancer barely making rent." The gulf between their realities seemed impossible to bridge, especially now that it was built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. Diana's phone rang with another urgent business call, and Connor watched her transform back into CEO mode before his eyes. Her voice became crisp and authoritative as she handled some crisis involving a client merger, demonstrating the competence and power that were her true nature. When the call ended, she tried to return to vulnerable Diana, but the damage was done. "This is who you really are?" Connor observed sadly. And Park Diana was just stress relief. The truth of his words hung between them like an unbridgeable chasm. "Both versions are real," Diana protested, but Connor was already gathering Mason's origami supplies. "I can't do this," he said, his voice thick with disappointment. "I can't be your escape from reality. Mason and I aren't research subjects or stress relief." He handed her the origami cranes that Mason had made for the twins, each one a small work of art that represented hours of careful concentration. "Tell the girls these are goodbye gifts." Diana reached for him, but Connor stepped back, protecting himself from further emotional manipulation. Mason didn't understand why they suddenly stopped visiting the park, why Diana and the twins had vanished from their routine as completely as if they had never existed. "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" he asked repeatedly, his anxiety levels spiking from the unexplained change in their schedule. Connor struggled to explain adult complications to a 7-year-old who saw the world in clear patterns of cause and effect. How could he tell his son that sometimes good people make choices that hurt others, even when they don't mean to? For 2 weeks, Connor agonized over Diana's job offer, while Mason created increasingly elaborate origami sculptures that seemed to reflect his own emotional confusion. The position would solve their financial problems and provide the stability that Mason desperately needed. But accepting it would mean validating Diana's deception, acknowledging that her manipulation had been successful in achieving her desired outcome. When Connor finally called Blackwood Digital to decline the position, the receptionist informed him that Ms. Blackwood was in an important merger meeting and couldn't be disturbed. Through the office building's glass windows, Connor glimpsed Diana in her natural habitat, commanding a boardroom full of executives in expensive suits, wielding authority with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through intelligence and determination. That was her real world, he realized. The park had been just a temporary escape from the pressures of corporate leadership. How could a freelance graphic designer with a special needs child ever compete with that level of success and responsibility? 1 month later, Connor's phone rang at nearly midnight. Mason was finally asleep after a particularly difficult day, and Connor was reviewing potential client proposals when Diana's name appeared on his caller ID. "Connor?" Her voice was shaky, uncertain, Nothing like the confident CEO who had interviewed him. "It's Diana. I need help." The vulnerability in her tone reminded him of their first meeting, when she had been just a frightened mother whose children were being bullied. "What's wrong?" Connor asked, his protective instincts overriding his lingering hurt. "Mason," Diana said, and Connor's heart stopped. "Is he okay? I saw the news about the school incident." Connor was confused. There had been no incident at Mason's school. "What are you talking about?" he asked, beginning to pace his small living room. Diana explained that she had seen a news report about bullying at Millbrook Elementary, and her first thought had been of Mason's safety. The realization that she was still monitoring their lives from a distance, still caring despite their painful separation, hit Connor like a physical blow. "There was no incident," Connor assured her, touched despite himself by her concern. "Mason is fine, but Diana, why do you still check on us?" The long pause that followed was filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. "Because despite everything that happened between us," she finally whispered, "you and Mason became part of my life that I couldn't just delete. Some connections survive even the worst mistakes." Her honesty felt different this time, raw and unfiltered, without the careful calculation that had characterized their previous interactions. Diana's full confession emerged slowly, like blood from a deep wound. She revealed the complete truth about her situation, how she had built Blackwood Digital from the ground up with her ex-husband, only to fight a brutal legal battle for control when their marriage disintegrated. She had won both the company and custody of the twins, but at the cost of becoming hyper-vigilant about protecting her family from further manipulation. The park visits were the only place she could be a normal mother instead of a CEO, under constant scrutiny from competitors and board members. "When you walked away that day," Diana continued, her voice breaking with emotion, "I understood why. I had power that you didn't know about. That's not a fair foundation for any relationship." She explained how she had removed herself completely from the hiring decision for Connor's position, ensuring that the board's offer was based solely on his qualifications rather than her personal feelings. "I withdrew my own recommendation because mixing personal and professional had already hurt us enough." Connor felt his carefully constructed anger beginning to crumble as he listened to Diana's explanation. She had sacrificed her business advantage to protect their personal relationship, even after he had rejected her. "You gave up hiring someone you knew was a good fit?" he asked, finally understanding the depth of her ethical struggle. "I gave up the chance to work with someone I cared about," Diana corrected, "because I had already violated his trust. Some principles matter more than profit margins." The origami crane that Mason had crafted that morning sat on Connor's kitchen table, number 100 in his son's newest series, created with a small note that read, "For Diana, because Daddy misses her smile." Connor described the gift to Diana over the phone, and he could hear her quiet sobbing on the other end. "How can he still want to see me after I lied?" she whispered. "Because children forgive more easily than adults," Connor replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "And because your kindness was real, even if your honesty was delayed." Diana didn't ask for immediate forgiveness or make grand promises about their future. Instead, she proposed something more difficult and more meaningful: complete honesty moving forward, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. "I know I can't undo my mistake," she said quietly. "But could we try again, with all cards on the table this time?" Connor found himself considering the possibility, not because he had stopped hurting, but because he recognized that some relationships were worth the risk of rebuilding from stronger foundations. "What would that look like?" Connor asked, genuinely curious about how they could navigate the power imbalance and trust issues that had derailed their first attempt. Diana outlined a plan that involved complete transparency. Honest conversations with Mason about her real job, slow integration of their families without hidden agendas, and Diana introducing Connor to her actual world rather than just her park escape. "I want you to meet CEO Diana," she said with a nervous laugh. "She's intimidating, but she's real, and she cares about you and Mason just as much as Park Diana did." 6 months later, Millbrook Park looked different in the golden light of autumn afternoon. Connor and Diana sat on their usual bench, watching Mason teach the twins advanced origami techniques while maintaining a comfortable silence that no longer felt fraught with hidden meanings. Diana had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Blackwood Digital, hiring an experienced COO to handle routine management while she focused on strategic oversight and work-life balance. The change had been difficult for someone accustomed to controlling every detail, but it allowed her to be present for the moments that truly mattered. Connor had found stable employment with a smaller design firm that appreciated his creative vision and understood his family obligations. The salary was lower than Diana's original offer, but the transparent interview process and honest working relationship felt infinitely more valuable than any amount of money. Diana had quietly purchased a modest house in Connor's neighborhood, close enough for the children to maintain their friendship, but far enough away to preserve everyone's independence and dignity. Mason's latest origami creation sat between Connor and Diana on the park bench, two separate cranes connected by a delicate paper chain, maintaining their individual identity while choosing to fly together. "Daddy," Mason asked with the directness that Connor had learned to treasure, "why didn't you and Diana get married like other grown-ups?" Connor smiled at his son's logical approach to adult relationships. "Because sometimes the best partnerships aren't about becoming the same person," he explained. "They're about choosing to support each other while staying true to yourself." The after-school program that Diana had quietly funded for children with special needs was thriving in its second semester, with Connor volunteering as an art instructor 2 afternoons per week. Together, they had created a space where children like Mason could explore their creativity without judgment, where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Local parents often commented on how the program demonstrated that successful people could remember what truly mattered, that children needed understanding and acceptance more than they needed perfection. Diana's relationship with her ex-husband, Richard, had settled into a cordial but distant pattern of shared custody and business interaction. The twins spent alternate weekends with their father, but they always returned to Diana's house with relief, as if they understood the difference between providing for children and truly nurturing them. "Some people learn from their mistakes," Diana had observed to Connor during one of their evening conversations. "Others just repeat them with different people." The lack of bitterness in her voice demonstrated how much she had grown during their separation. The original origami crane that Diana had kept throughout their difficult separation now sat on her kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light like a small beacon of hope. It served not as a shrine to past mistakes, but as a reminder that small gestures of faith could survive major storms if they were rooted in genuine care rather than selfish manipulation. The twins had learned origami from Mason, creating paper gardens that decorated Diana's refrigerator alongside Connor's business cards and Mason's school artwork, the visual representation of two families choosing to blend without losing their individual character. On quiet evenings, when the children were absorbed in their creative projects and the adult world seemed temporarily manageable, Connor and Diana would sit together, planning the future they were building one honest conversation at a time. There were no dramatic romantic declarations or unrealistic promises of perfection. Instead, they focused on the steady work of partnership, supporting each other's professional goals, sharing parenting responsibilities, and creating stability for 4 children who had already experienced too much adult chaos in their young lives. "Think we're doing this right?" Diana asked one evening as they watched Mason teach the twins how to fold paper flowers for Mother's Day. Connor considered the question seriously, observing how naturally their children interacted, how easily they had adapted to their unconventional family structure. "I think we're doing this honestly," he replied, reaching for Diana's hand. "Sometimes that's more important than right." The simple touch felt like a promise, not of perfection, but of continued effort, mutual respect, and the courage to keep building something real from the foundation of hard-won trust. Mason approached them with his newest creation, an origami envelope sealed with careful precision. "What's this for, buddy?" Connor asked, accepting the delicate construction with appropriate reverence. "For keeping important promises safe," Mason explained with the matter-of-fact wisdom that never failed to amaze the adults in his life. Inside the envelope, written in Mason's careful 7-year-old handwriting, was a list. Promises that matter. Tell truth even when scary. Stay friends even when different. Keep making beautiful things together. Diana read the note over Connor's shoulder, her eyes misting with the kind of tears that came from unexpected grace rather than sorrow. "How does he always know exactly what we need to remember?" she whispered, watching Mason return to his origami station with the satisfied air of someone who had completed important work. "Because children see what adults tend to overcomplicate," Connor replied, folding the precious note carefully back into its paper envelope. "They understand that the most beautiful relationships aren't built on perfection. They're built on the willingness to keep trying, one careful fold at a time." As the sun set over Millbrook Park, casting long shadows across the playground where their story had begun, Connor and Diana sat in comfortable silence, watching 4 children create art together, without worrying about the labels or definitions that so often constrained adult relationships. They had learned that sometimes the strongest foundations weren't built on romantic love or legal contracts, but on the simple commitment to show up honestly for the people who mattered most. And in the growing collection of origami cranes that decorated both their homes, they found daily reminders that beautiful things could indeed emerge from the most unlikely materials, if handled with enough patience, care, and hope.